The fog rolled through Maplewood like something alive, thick tendrils curling around the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving nature retreat. My rental car's headlights carved weak paths through the gray wall that seemed to swallow everything beyond 10 feet, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary as I navigated the winding mountain road that led into town. It was Monday night, well past 9 o'clock, and the GPS on my phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me with nothing but hand-drawn directions on a napkin that the gas station attendant in Brattleboro had sketched out with shaking hands. Maplewood announced itself with a weathered wooden sign that emerged from the mist like a gravestone, its paint peeling in long strips that reminded me of dead skin. Welcome to Maplewood, population 300, established 1847. Someone had scratched out part of the population number and written something else, but the fog made it impossible to read. The trees pressed close to the road here, their branches intertwining overhead like arthritic fingers, blocking out what little moonlight might have penetrated the cloud cover. My name is Detective Jonathan Reeves, though most people call me John, and 3 days ago I was working homicide in downtown Los Angeles. Now I was driving through what felt like the set of a low-budget horror movie, wondering how exactly my life had taken such a sharp left turn. The answer, of course, was Captain Morrison's red face screaming about integrity and whistleblowing and how I'd destroyed the reputation of good officers by exposing the bribery ring that had been running out of the precinct for God knows how long. Turns out doing the right thing doesn't always feel very rewarding when you're packing your desk into cardboard boxes while your former partners avoid eye contact. The first buildings of Maplewood materialized from the fog like ships emerging from a storm. Most were dark, their windows staring blindly into the night, but I could make out the basic layout of a typical New England mountain town that had seen better decades. A general store with a sagging porch, a diner with half its neon sign burned out, and what looked like it might have been a tourist information center back when Maplewood actually had tourists. Everything had that abandoned quality that comes when economic reality collides with small-town dreams. I pulled up in front of the sheriff's station, a low brick building that squatted between a hardware store and what appeared to be a bar called the Broken Antler. The station's parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through like green fingers, and my headlights illuminated a single patrol car that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line sometime during the Bush administration. The elder Bush. The fog seemed to thicken as I stepped out of the car, wrapping around my legs with an almost tactile quality that made my skin crawl. The air tasted of pine needles and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. I shouldered my duffel bag and walked toward the station, my footsteps echoing strangely in the oppressive silence. Sheriff Margaret O'Connor was waiting for me inside, though I hadn't called ahead to announce my arrival. She stood behind the front desk like she'd been posed there, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. Her smile was welcoming enough, but there was something stiff about it, like she was concentrating very hard on remembering how smiling was supposed to work. "Detective Reeves," she said, extending a hand that felt surprisingly cold despite the warmth of the station's interior. "Welcome to Maplewood. We've been expecting you." Her eyes didn't blink often enough. I noticed that right away, the way she would stare for long moments without the natural flutter of eyelids that most people do unconsciously. It was probably nothing. People in small towns sometimes had different social rhythms than what I was used to, but after 15 years of police work, you develop instincts about when something feels off. "Thank you, Sheriff O'Connor. I appreciate you taking me on such short notice. Maggie, please, and it's no trouble at all. We can use the help." She gestured toward a younger man who had been sitting at one of the desks, pecking away at an ancient computer with the enthusiasm of someone half his age. "This is Deputy Alex Thompson. He'll be showing you around, getting you settled." Alex bounced up from his chair with the kind of energy that suggested he'd been waiting all evening for something interesting to happen. He was maybe 28, with sandy hair and the sort of eager expression that reminded me of my first week on the force, back when I still believed that police work was mostly about helping people and catching bad guys. "It's great to meet you, Detective," Alex said, pumping my hand with genuine enthusiasm. Not much excitement around here usually, but having a real LA detective join the team, that's pretty cool. Just John is fine, I told him, already feeling the weight of his expectations. And I'm sure Maplewood has its own challenges. Maggie's smile flickered for just a moment, like a light bulb with a loose connection. Oh, it does. Every place has its secrets, doesn't it? Before I could ask what she meant, the station door opened and an elderly woman stepped inside, bringing with her a gust of fog that seemed to cling to her clothes like living things. She was exactly what you'd expect from a Norman Rockwell painting: thick wool cardigan, wire-rimmed glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes, and the measured movements of someone who'd learned to navigate the world carefully. "Evelyn," Maggie said, and I could hear relief in her voice. "I was hoping you'd stop by. This is Detective Reeves, our new hire. John, meet Evelyn Carter. She runs our historical society and knows more about this town than anyone." Evelyn Carter looked like she'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, but when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and her gaze sharp in a way that suggested she saw more than most people. "Welcome to Maplewood, Detective," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose her words carefully. "I hope you'll find our little town educational." "I'm sure I will," I replied, though something in her tone made it sound less like a pleasantry and more like a warning. "Evelyn knows all the old stories," Alex chimed in. "Ghost tales, local legends, that sort of thing. Great stuff for a campfire." "Stories have power," Evelyn said quietly, her eyes never leaving mine. "They carry truth, even when they seem impossible, sometimes, especially then." I was about to ask her to elaborate when Alex cleared his throat. "Should I show Detective Reeves to his quarters? He's probably tired from the drive." The walk to the Maple Rest Inn took us down Main Street, past storefronts that seemed to watch our progress through dark windows. Alex kept up a steady stream of chatter about the town. Who ran what business, which families had been here for generations, the best places to get coffee and a decent meal. Normal small-town information, but delivered with an intensity that suggested he was trying very hard to fill the silence. "We should stop by the Broken Antler tomorrow," Alex suggested as we walked. "Tom Jenkins runs it. Good guy. Been here forever. Makes the best coffee in 3 counties, and he knows everyone worth knowing." "Quiet town," I commented as we walked, fog swirling around our legs like water. "Oh yeah, super quiet," Alex agreed quickly. "Sometimes I think it's too quiet, you know? Like the place is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." He said it like a joke, but his laugh sounded forced. The Maple Rest Inn sat at the end of Main Street like a period at the end of a sentence, its vacancy sign flickering weakly through the fog. Alex handed me a key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a maple leaf and assured me that someone would pick me up in the morning for my first official patrol. "Sweet dreams," he called out as he disappeared back into the fog, leaving me alone in the parking lot. My room was clean but generic, the kind of place that existed solely for the convenience of travelers passing through. I set my bag on the bed and was reaching for the curtains when I decided to start my night patrol early. Something about the oppressive quiet outside made me want to familiarize myself with the town's layout before my first official shift. I grabbed my jacket and stepped back into the fog-shrouded night. Main Street stretched before me like a tunnel, the few functioning streetlights creating weak pools of yellow light that the mist seemed to devour. I walked slowly, cataloging the businesses and getting a feel for the town's geography, when my watch began beeping insistently. The digital display flashed 2:44 a.m. in angry red numbers, which was impossible since it had been showing the correct time when I'd left the inn. I was still staring at the malfunctioning display when I saw it. Something tall moved at the edge of my vision, standing near the tree line where Main Street gave way to forest. For a moment, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe someone out for a late-night walk or a local having trouble sleeping, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that seemed to dangle past where they should have ended. It stood perfectly still, and in the weak glow of the nearest street light, I could see that where its face should have been was nothing but smooth darkness. I blinked hard, pressing my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. When I looked again, the thing was gone, leaving only fog swirling where it had stood. Fatigue, I told myself. 3 days of stress, a 6-hour drive through mountain roads, and now I was seeing things that weren't there. It happened to cops sometimes, especially after traumatic events. Your mind played tricks, showed you threats where none existed. But my hand was trembling as I turned to head back to the inn. That's when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible above the rustle of leaves that shouldn't have been moving in the still air. "John." It was my sister's voice. Sarah's voice, calling my name the way she used to when we were kids, and she wanted me to follow her on some adventure that would probably get us both in trouble. But Sarah had been dead for 3 years, killed by a drunk driver 2 weeks before Christmas, and she was buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery 3,000 miles away. I spun around, heart hammering, searching the fog-shrouded street for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no distant traffic, no night sounds at all. Even the fog seemed to hang motionless, as if the entire world was holding its breath. For a long moment, nothing moved except my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the oppressive quiet broke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car engine turned over and faded into the night. The normal sounds of a sleeping town returned, and the fog began its slow drift between the buildings. But I stood frozen on the empty street, staring into the mist where I could have sworn I'd seen a tall, thin shadow slip away between the trees, moving with that same flowing gait I'd glimpsed near the motel. The next morning brought weak sunlight that turned the fog into a golden haze, and Alex picked me up with coffee and what he assured me were the best donuts in 3 counties. He seemed more relaxed in daylight, chatting about the local wildlife and pointing out landmarks as we drove through town. "First call of the day," he announced as his radio crackled to life. "Missing hiker, guy named Robert Chen from Boston, was supposed to check out of the Maple Rest yesterday morning but never did. Housekeeping found his room empty, bed not slept in." We drove to the trailhead where Chen's rental car sat abandoned, fog still clinging to the trees despite the morning sun. The hiking trail disappeared into the forest after about 50 yards, and I could understand why someone might get disoriented in weather like this. 20 minutes into the woods, I found something that made me stop cold. Across the trail, stretching from one tree to another like a snail's track, was a line of something that wasn't quite slime and wasn't quite sap. It glistened in the filtered sunlight with an oily iridescence, and when I knelt down to examine it more closely, I caught that same sweet smell I'd noticed the night before, but stronger now, almost nauseating. "Alex," I called out, studying the luminescent trail that seemed to pulse with its own faint light. "You need to see this." As he jogged over to examine the strange substance, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in these fog-shrouded woods, Robert Chen was waiting to be found. Or what was left of him. Wednesday morning arrived with the same oppressive fog that had blanketed Maplewood since my arrival, thick tendrils clinging to the trees like cobwebs made of mist. Alex picked me up at 8 sharp, his enthusiasm undimmed by the weather, though I caught him glancing nervously at the fog-shrouded tree line as we drove to the station. "Sleep okay?" he asked, but something in his tone suggested he hadn't. "Well enough," I lied. The truth was I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of Sarah's voice calling my name from the fog. Rational thought told me it was stress, fatigue, my mind playing tricks. But 15 years of police work had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. We returned to the hiking trail where Robert Chen had vanished, armed with better equipment this time: cameras, evidence bags, measuring tape. The luminescent trail I'd discovered the day before had grown longer overnight, stretching deeper into the woods like a slug's path made of liquid mercury. In daylight, the substance looked even more unnatural, pulsing with a faint inner light that made my skin crawl. "Jesus," Alex whispered, kneeling beside the trail. "It's warm." I crouched next to him, holding my hand inches above the slime. Heat radiated from it like body temperature, and that sickly sweet smell was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something organic and rotten that reminded me of meat left in the sun. 20 feet further up the trail, we found the claw marks. Deep gouges in the bark of an oak tree, 4 parallel lines that carved through the wood like it was butter. I'd seen bear scratches before, but these were different. Too precise, too uniform, and far too high up the trunk for any animal I knew. "Bear?" Alex suggested hopefully, but his voice lacked conviction. I measured the scratches with my tape measure. Each gouge was exactly 3 inches apart, and they extended from 6 feet off the ground to nearly 8 feet. What kind of bear is 8 feet tall and has claws this precise? We followed the slime trail deeper into the woods, documenting everything with the camera. The fog seemed to thicken around us, muffling sound until our footsteps became the only noise in an unnaturally silent forest. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. "This doesn't feel right," Alex muttered, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by growing unease. I was about to agree when we found Robert Chen's backpack. It hung from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, torn fabric fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. The pack had been shredded by something with very sharp claws, its contents scattered across the forest floor: trail mix, water bottles, a first aid kit, all covered in that same luminescent slime. "How did it get up there?" Alex asked, staring at the backpack. I studied the tree trunk. More claw marks, these ones leading straight up the bark in a spiral pattern, as if something had climbed the tree with impossible ease. Something with very long arms and very sharp claws. We spent the morning collecting evidence, but by noon the fog had grown so thick we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Reluctantly, we headed back to town, both of us silent with the weight of what we'd found. The interviews that afternoon confirmed my growing suspicions that Maplewood harbored secrets darker than a simple missing person case. We visited 5 residents who claimed to have seen Robert Chen on Tuesday morning, and each conversation left me more unsettled than the last. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, smiled too widely when she described Chen buying trail mix and bottled water. Her eyes didn't blink for the entire 5-minute conversation, and her voice had a rehearsed quality, like she was reciting lines from a play she'd performed 100 times. Mr. Hendricks, who owned the gas station, gave us the exact same description of Chen's appearance, down to the specific shade of his hiking boots that Mrs. Patterson had provided, word for word. When I pressed him for details, his smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something calculating beneath the friendly veneer. But it was Sheriff O'Connor's reaction that truly set my teeth on edge. When Alex and I returned to the station with our evidence bags full of slime and photographs of claw marks, Maggie listened to our report with that same forced smile I'd noticed the night before. "Probably just animals," she said, her voice flat and monotone. "Mountain lions sometimes pass through here, or bears. Yes, definitely bears." "Bears don't climb trees that high," I pointed out, "and this slime—" "Sap," she interrupted, her eyes widening unnaturally. "Tree sap. Gets phosphorescent sometimes, depending on the mineral content in the soil." Alex shot me a look that suggested he found her explanation as unconvincing as I did, but Maggie was already turning away, dismissing us with a wave of her hand that seemed too fluid, too boneless. That evening, I found myself at the Broken Antler, nursing a beer and trying to make sense of the day's discoveries. The bar was exactly what you'd expect from a small Vermont mountain town: dark wood, dim lighting, the kind of place where locals gathered to complain about the weather and gossip about their neighbors. Tom Jenkins proved to be a man in his mid-40s with calloused hands and the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. He poured my beer with practiced efficiency, but I caught him studying me in the mirror behind the bar, his expression guarded. "You're the new cop," he said. It wasn't a question. Detective Reeves. Just arrived Monday night. Heard you found something interesting up on the hiking trail. Word traveled fast in a town this size. I took a sip of my beer, noting that Tom's hands were steady as he wiped down glasses, his movements controlled and precise. Unlike the other locals I'd met, his smile reached his eyes, and he blinked at normal intervals. "What do you know about the springs north of town?" I asked, remembering Evelyn Carter's cryptic comments from the night before. Tom's hand paused mid-wipe. "Why do you ask?" "Evelyn mentioned something about the town's history. Meteorite crash in the 1800s? Tom glanced around the bar, confirming we were alone, then leaned closer. "My family's been here for 4 generations," he said quietly. "My great-grandfather used to tell stories about the year the stars fell, 1847, same year the town was founded. Said a piece of the sky crashed into the springs up north, turned the water black for months." "What kind of stories?" "The kind parents tell children to keep them away from dangerous places." Tom's voice dropped even lower. "Stories about things that lived in the corrupted water. Things that could look like people but weren't people. Things that could speak in the voices of the dead." A chill ran down my spine. "You believe those stories?" Tom set down his glass and looked at me directly. "Detective, I've lived in this town my entire life. I've seen things that would make you question everything you think you know about reality. My sister vanished 3 years ago. Police said she ran away, but I know better. I found her clothes by the springs, covered in that same slime you probably found on the trail." Before I could respond, the bar's front door opened and Sheriff O'Connor walked in. Her smile was as stiff as ever, but her eyes fixed on Tom and me with an intensity that made my hand instinctively move toward my service weapon. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying that same rehearsed quality I'd noticed earlier. "Detective Reeves, working late?" "Just having a beer," I replied carefully. Good. Just remember, Detective, small towns have their own rhythms. Sometimes it's best not to dig too deep into old stories. People might get the wrong idea." She left without ordering anything, but I felt her eyes on us through the window long after the door closed. Tom waited until her footsteps faded before speaking again. "You need to be careful who you trust," he whispered. "This town isn't what it seems. 40% of the people you meet aren't people at all." That night, I couldn't sleep. Tom's words echoed in my mind as I lay in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling. 40%. In a town of 300, that meant over 100 of my neighbors weren't human. At midnight, I gave up on sleep and decided to take a walk. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing stars that seemed unusually bright against the black sky. I walked down Main Street, my footsteps echoing strangely in the silence, when I saw him. A man I recognized from the general store, walking alone toward the edge of town. Something about his gait caught my attention. Too smooth, too fluid, like he was gliding rather than walking. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows, my police training taking over. He stopped at the tree line where Main Street gave way to forest. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, his back to me. Then, in the pale starlight, I watched him change. His skin began to ripple like water, pale and translucent, revealing dark veins that pulsed beneath the surface. His face smoothed out, features melting away, until nothing remained but a blank void where his eyes and mouth should have been. His limbs stretched and elongated, arms becoming spindly appendages that ended in curved claws that gleamed like polished bone. The thing turned toward me, and where its face should have been was nothing but darkness. It stood there for a moment, head tilted as if listening, then melted back into the forest with that same flowing gait I'd witnessed before. I stood frozen in the shadows for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. When I finally returned to the bar, Tom was waiting for me, a fresh beer already poured. "You saw one," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Now you understand." Tom raised his glass in a mock toast. "Welcome to Maplewood, Detective. Try not to let them know you know." I was about to respond when I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror behind the bar. For just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, my reflection smiled back at me with a face that wasn't my own. A blank, featureless void where my features should have been. When I blinked, it was just me again, pale and shaken but human. Tom hadn't seen it, but the message was clear. They were watching. They knew I knew. And the game had just begun. Friday morning arrived with the same oppressive fog, but this time I was ready for it. The events of the past few days had stripped away any pretense that Maplewood was a normal small town, and I needed allies if I was going to survive whatever was happening here. Tom was waiting for me at the Broken Antler when I arrived at 8 a.m., his face grim in the pale morning light that filtered through the windows. He'd already brewed coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the musty air of the empty bar like a promise of normalcy in a world gone mad. "How long have you known?" I asked without preamble. 3 years, he replied, pouring 2 cups with steady hands. "Ever since my sister Rachel disappeared. Found her clothes by the springs, covered in that same slime you've been tracking. Police said she ran away, but Rachel wouldn't leave without telling me. We were all the family each other had left." I studied his face, looking for any of the telltale signs I'd learned to recognize. The too wide smile, the unnatural stillness, the eyes that didn't blink enough. Tom's grief was real, his anger genuine. He was human. "We need to find others," I said, taking charge of the situation. "People who've noticed the wrongness, but haven't known what to call it." Tom nodded, his expression shifting to one of respect. "I know who we can trust. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the missing hiker. She's suspected something for years. And Marcus Wells, teaches at the elementary school. He's noticed children acting strange." We spent the morning carefully identifying others. Tom's network was small, but solid. People who'd noticed the wrongness, but had no framework to understand it until now. By noon, we'd assembled a group of 10 in the bar's back room. Tom and myself, Dr. Chen with her worried eyes and steady hands, Marcus Wells clutching a thermos of coffee like a lifeline, Alex who'd arrived looking shaken, and 5 others whose stories painted a horrifying picture. "It started slow," Dr. Chen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Patients coming in for routine checkups, but their baseline vitals had changed completely. Heart rates, blood pressure, body temperature, all slightly off, like they were mimicking human physiology but not quite getting it right." Alex had remained silent through most of the meeting, but when Marcus mentioned children forgetting their own names, he finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "Last night," he said, "I heard my mother calling my name. She's been dead for 2 years, but there she was, standing at the end of my street, telling me to come closer." His hands shook as he gripped his coffee cup. I knew it wasn't her, but for a moment I almost believed it, almost walked right into its arms. That's when we knew Alex was truly one of us. The mimics had tried to lure him, just as they'd whispered my sister's name in the fog. "We need to see their source," I said, taking control of the planning. "Tom, you mentioned the springs. If that's where this started, it's where we'll find answers." Tom spread a hand-drawn map across the table, his jaw set with determination, despite the fear in his eyes. "The springs are here, about 3 miles north of town. Evelyn's stories about the meteorite crash. I think she was trying to warn us. We spent Friday afternoon preparing. Dr. Chen packed medical supplies. Marcus brought cameras to document what we found. Tom armed himself with a hunting rifle, though after what I'd witnessed, I doubted conventional weapons would be effective. I made the tactical decisions, assigning roles, planning our approach. We leave 3 behind, I decided. If we all disappear at once, they'll know we're organized. The fear was palpable, but they looked to me for guidance, and I felt the weight of their trust. Leadership had always come naturally to me, but this was different. These weren't fellow cops. They were ordinary people who'd stumbled into a nightmare. Saturday morning brought us to the trailhead at dawn. The hike to the springs took us deep into territory none of us had seen before, through woods that grew progressively more wrong the further we traveled. The trees here were too tall, their branches twisted at unnatural angles that hurt to look at directly. Tom walked point, his rifle ready, moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent his life in these woods. Despite his fear, he pushed forward, driven by memories of his lost sister. "She used to walk these trails," he said quietly, "before they took her." Alex stayed close to me, his earlier enthusiasm completely gone, replaced by a paralyzing fear that made him jump at every sound. "John," he whispered, "what if we don't make it back?" "We will," I assured him, though I wasn't certain. "Stay close. Follow my lead." We found the springs in a clearing that shouldn't have existed, a perfect circle of dead earth surrounding a pool of water so black it seemed to absorb light. The smell hit us first, that sickly sweet odor I'd learned to associate with the mimics, but stronger here, thick enough to taste. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, raising his camera with trembling hands. The water's surface rippled without any wind to disturb it, and beneath its dark surface, shapes moved with purpose. A pulsating, slimy mass writhed at the bottom, and I realized we were looking at their hive, the source of Maplewood's infection. That's when they attacked. They came from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the water, from shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide anything. Tall, pale figures with limbs too long and faces that were voids. They moved with inhuman speed, their voices mimicking our loved ones. "Sarah," one called in Dr. Chen's voice. "Help me." "Run," I shouted, taking command of the chaos. Tom fired his rifle, the bullet punching through the nearest mimic without slowing it down. His face crumbled as he realized our weapons were useless, but he didn't break. Instead, he grabbed Marcus and pulled him toward the trees. "This way," Tom called out, his knowledge of the forest our only advantage. Despite everything, he held his ground, covering our retreat with useless bullets that showed more courage than sense. We scattered into the woods, branches tearing at our clothes as the mimics pursued us. Behind me, I heard Dr. Chen scream, not in fear, but in recognition of something impossible. When I turned, she was gone, pulled into the darkness where something wet and organic pulsed in the shadows. "Sarah," Alex called out, his voice breaking with terror, but there was no response except the sound of something being absorbed, dissolved, made part of something larger. "Move!" I ordered, grabbing Alex's arm and pulling him forward. "We can't help her now." The 7 of us who remained ran through the fog-shrouded forest until our lungs burned, following Tom, who seemed to know every hidden path. We didn't stop until we reached an old hunting cabin that sat in a small clearing. "My grandfather's place," Tom gasped, his hands steady despite everything as he fumbled with the lock. "Built it to keep bears out." We barricaded ourselves inside as darkness fell, and I organized our defenses, checking every possible entry point. The cabin was small and cramped, but its thick log walls felt like our only hope. Tom worked beside me, reinforcing the windows with grim determination. "They took Rachel from me," he said. "They won't take anyone else." Alex huddled in the corner, his fear now complete terror. "They're coming back," he whispered. "I can hear them." They came as the moon rose, circling the cabin like wolves. We could hear them outside, claws scraping against wood, testing our defenses. Worse were the voices. "Alex," something called in perfect imitation of his mother's voice. "Alex, honey, come outside. I'm scared." Alex sobbed. His hands pressed over his ears, but I moved to his side. "It's not her," I said firmly. "You know it's not her." "Help me," another voice pleaded, and we all recognized Dr. Chen's tone, though we'd watched her disappear into the slime. Marcus broke down completely when his daughter's voice began begging him to open the door. Tom gripped his useless rifle with white knuckles, but he stayed at his post by the window, watching for movement. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. Something was testing the window boards, claws finding gaps in our defenses. "They're getting in," Alex whispered, his terror infectious. "Hold the line," I commanded, though my own hands were shaking. "Don't let them break us." A board splintered. Wood chips rained down as claws tore through the barrier. Through the gap, I could see a pale void where a face should have been, tilted at an impossible angle as it studied us. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splinters. The mimic flowed through the opening like liquid shadow, its elongated limbs reaching for us with predatory grace. I raised my service weapon and fired 3 shots center mass, watching in horror as the bullets passed through its translucent form without leaving a mark. The creature turned toward me, that faceless void tilting with what might have been curiosity. Tom stepped forward, his rifle raised, and I saw in his eyes the same determination that had carried him through 3 years of suspicion and loss. "Come on then," he growled. Alex pressed himself against the wall, his fear complete, whimpering as the thing's attention shifted between us. The mimic's limbs stretched toward me, and I realized with crystalline clarity that everything we thought we knew about fighting these things was wrong. The mimic's elongated limb swept through the air where my head had been a split second before, its claws leaving gouges in the wooden wall behind me. Tom's rifle butt connected with its torso, passing through the translucent flesh like it was made of fog, but the impact somehow staggered it backward long enough for Alex to grab my arm and pull me toward the cabin's back door. "This way!" Tom shouted, abandoning his useless weapon as we burst through the rear exit into the fog-shrouded dawn. Sunday morning had arrived without fanfare, gray light filtering through the mist as we stumbled into the forest behind the cabin. Behind us, the sounds of splintering wood and inhuman screeching filled the air as more mimics poured through the broken window. 7 of us had made it out. Tom, Alex, Marcus, and 4 others, whose names I barely knew but whose terror matched my own. The temperature had dropped overnight, and our breath formed white clouds that mingled with the ever-present fog. "The hardware store," I gasped, taking charge as we ran through the underbrush. "Tom, you know these woods better than anyone. Get us to town without using the main roads." Tom nodded grimly, his face set with the determination I'd come to respect over these past few days. Despite losing his sister to these things, despite watching Dr. Chen disappear into that writhing mass at the springs, he pressed forward with a courage that humbled me. "Follow me. Stay quiet. They hunt by sound as much as sight, and we're not moving fast enough to outrun them." We made our way through the forest in single file, Tom leading us along deer paths and forgotten trails that wound between the ancient pines. The trees here seemed older than they should be, their bark darkened and twisted into unnatural shapes that hurt to look at directly. Alex stayed close to me, his earlier fear transformed into a desperate resolve. The boy who'd greeted me with such enthusiasm just days ago had aged years in the span of a week. It took us nearly 2 hours to reach the edge of town, emerging from the tree line behind Peterson's Hardware like refugees from a war zone. The store squatted in the morning mist, its parking lot empty except for an old pickup truck that Tom eyed with obvious relief. "Old Peterson's been dead 3 years, he explained quietly as he produced a key from his pocket. "Mimics got him early, but some of us have been maintaining his place, just in case we ever needed supplies for something like this." The hardware store felt like a sanctuary after the horrors of the night, its familiar smell of motor oil and fertilizer almost comforting. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with everything a rural community might need: tools, seeds, rope, and most importantly, for our purposes, industrial supplies. We gathered what we needed methodically: industrial-grade explosives used for stump removal, blasting caps, electrical wire, timing devices, everything necessary to bring down whatever unholy thing lived in those corrupted springs. My hands shook as I worked, but the familiar routine of planning an operation helped steady my nerves. "You sure about this?" Alex asked as I rigged the charges, his hands trembling as he helped me splice wires together. "What if we're wrong? What if destroying the springs doesn't stop them?" "Then we die," I said simply, meeting his eyes in the dim light of the store. "But if we don't try, everyone dies. Every town they spread to, every person they assimilate. This ends here, one way or another." Marcus had been examining the old truck in Peterson's garage, and he returned with cautiously optimistic news. "It runs," he reported, wiping grease from his hands. "Barely, but it'll get us out of here when we're done, assuming we live that long." The journey back to the springs felt like walking to our own execution. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the twisted landscape around the corrupted water source. The trees here were wrong in ways that went beyond mere disease. Too tall, their bark blackened and weeping some kind of dark sap that stained the ground beneath them in patterns that suggested deliberate marking. The springs themselves had changed dramatically since yesterday's ambush. The black water now bubbled and roiled like a living thing, and at its center, a pulsating mass of flesh and slime rose from the depths like some primordial tumor. Veins of luminescent fluid ran through the writhing surface, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat I'd ever heard. I could see shapes moving within the mass, bodies, or what had once been bodies, suspended in the organic matrix like insects in amber. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, raising his rifle despite knowing it was useless. "The thing's grown since yesterday. It's feeding on them." The mimics knew we were coming. They emerged from the trees around the clearing with predatory grace. Dozens of them, their faceless voids turning toward us with what I could only describe as hungry anticipation. Their limbs stretched and flexed, claws gleaming in the pale light, and then they began to speak. "John," Sarah's voice called out, achingly familiar and impossibly real. "Why did you leave me behind? Why didn't you save me from the accident?" Alex sobbed openly as his mother's voice joined the chorus, sweet and loving as it had been in life. "Alex, baby, come to Mama. Everything's going to be okay. I've been waiting for you." Tom's jaw clenched as Rachel's voice whispered from the darkness between the trees. "Tommy, I'm so cold out here. I've been waiting for you to find me. Please don't leave me alone again." "Don't listen," I commanded, forcing steel into my voice even as my sister's pleas tore at my heart like physical wounds. "It's not them. It was never them. They're using our love against us." I ran toward the springs with the explosive pack strapped to my back, Tom and Alex flanking me while the others provided what cover they could. The mimics flowed toward us like a pale tide, their movements unnaturally fluid, but Tom's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave us precious seconds of advantage. At the water's edge, I plunged the charges deep into the pulsating mass at the spring's center. The organic material recoiled from my touch like a living thing, and for a moment I felt something vast and alien brush against my consciousness. Hungry, endless, patient, beyond human understanding. "Now!" I shouted, triggering the detonator as we dove for cover behind the nearest trees. The explosion shattered the morning silence, sending black water and chunks of organic matter skyward in a geyser of destruction. The ground shook beneath our feet like an earthquake, and the mimics' voices rose in a harmonious shriek of rage and pain that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But they didn't die. Even as their breeding ground collapsed into a smoking crater, the surviving mimics scattered into the forest, their forms already adapting, evolving, preparing to establish new colonies elsewhere. We'd hurt them, but we hadn't destroyed them. We piled into the truck and drove without stopping until we reached Brattleboro, where we told our story to skeptical police officers who found nothing but an empty village when they investigated the next day. No slime trails, no claw marks, no evidence of the horror we'd witnessed. The official report listed Maplewood as abandoned due to economic factors. 6 months later, I was working security at a mall in Burlington when I saw the news report on the food court television. 3 more disappearances near the old Maplewood site. Hikers who'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned cars and that familiar sickly sweet smell that made my hands tremble with remembered terror. Last night, walking home from my shift through the quiet streets of Burlington, I heard it again. Sarah's voice calling my name from the fog that had rolled in off Lake Champlain. When I turned toward the sound, a tall figure stood at the edge of the streetlight's glow, too distant to make out clearly, but with proportions that made my blood freeze in my veins. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was just trauma. Maybe my mind, scarred by what I'd seen in Maplewood, was creating threats where none existed. But as I write this final account, I can smell that sweet rot on the wind, and I know the truth with crystalline certainty. They're still out there, still hunting, still spreading to new places where no one will believe the warnings, and no one will ever believe us.